And it's just strange. Annie Guthrie, we don't think is staying there anymore, or her husband. We don't know.
Because what you're about to hear sounds like something ripped straight from a streaming crime series. Except this time it isn't scripted. It's real. It's chaotic. And it's sending shockwaves through headlines everywhere. Savannah Guthrie's sister arrested in connection with the disappearance of their own mother.
Guys, all right, so I'm leaving Annie Guthrie's house now. If you look at my previous videos, there were 3 sheriff's deputies there.
Yes, that headline landed hard. Phones lit up instantly. Group chats went silent. And suddenly the image of a picture-perfect American family began to crack in public view. How does a quiet evening with family spiral into a full-scale investigation?
They went in with like evidence equipment and they were taking photos inside the house. And we know for sure that they were taking photos because we could see flashes through the window.
How does a simple ride home end with detectives asking questions no one expected? And why, out of everyone connected to that night, did investigators start focusing on the daughter? That's where the story begins to take a turn people didn't see coming. Because there's one detail that keeps echoing through every update, every report, every theory spreading online. 41 minutes. 41 unexplained minutes inside an 84-year-old woman's home before she vanished without a trace.
And when I got here, there were 3 deputies that had just arrived. They have private security here. NBC hired private security.
Coincidence? Or the moment everything started to unravel? Authorities now believe the disappearance may not have been random at all. Some investigators say the sequence of events appears deliberate, controlled, even planned.
Closed all the blinds. I could see them taking pictures. Yeah, there you go, right? That's some of the stuff they brought out. I could see them taking pictures in the garage.
And right now, one name sits directly in the center of the growing storm. Annie Guthrie. So stay with me because tonight we're breaking down the timeline, the contradictions, the investigation, and the discovery that turned a missing person case into a national controversy.
The timeline that they gave us yesterday. 9:48 p.m., Nancy's garage door opened. We believe that's the family. We believe it was Tomas.
When investigators returned to the property, it was immediately clear this wasn't a routine follow-up visit. They arrived carrying cameras, sealed evidence containers, and documentation kits normally used when detectives believe a scene may hold physical clues. Neighbors standing across the street later said flashes of light could be seen through the windows as officers moved from room to room photographing surfaces, furniture, and entry points. Those flashes told people something important, because only days earlier, the same house had been surrounded by cameras for a very different reason.
Be wrong because the sheriff keeps changing his story on that. He told the New York Times it was Tomas. Then he changed it at the presser to, we're going to go with family.
The Guthrie family had appeared together in front of reporters asking for help finding Nancy Guthrie. Savannah Guthrie stood calmly at the podium, her voice steady as she asked the public for prayers and information. Cameras rolled while microphones captured every word. Cameron stood nearby. Annie Guthrie stood beside them as well, quiet, composed, watching the crowd of reporters in front of the house. That moment the message was simple. Nancy Guthrie was missing and the family wanted answers. But now the focus had shifted. Authorities still hadn't revealed every detail that led them there, but Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed investigators had begun examining inconsistencies in the timeline surrounding Nancy's disappearance.
If you go from 1:47 a.m., which is when the doorbell cam got disconnected, to 2:28 a.m., which is when her...
That word quickly became the center of attention. Inconsistencies is the same language investigators often use when small details in witness statements stop aligning with the physical evidence. Not necessarily proof of wrongdoing, but enough to justify digging deeper. So detectives started rebuilding the timeline from the beginning. On the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared, she had been at Annie's house for dinner. According to the original account, the evening seemed completely ordinary. Nancy arrived before sunset. They sat down together. They talked. At one point, they played a board game around the kitchen table. Nothing about that evening suggested it would become the last confirmed time Nancy was seen by her family. Later that night, Annie's husband, Tommaso Keone, drove Nancy back to her house. Digital records from Nancy's garage system show the door opening at exactly 9:48 p.m. 2 minutes later, it closed again. A short window, just long enough for someone to walk inside, place belongings on a table, and settle in for the night. At first, investigators believed that moment marked the end of the story. But hours later, something else happened at 1:47 a.m. Nancy's front door camera stopped transmitting. According to investigators, the device wasn't simply disconnected from the internet. The hardware itself had been tampered with. Then, 41 minutes later, another signal dropped. Nancy's medical monitoring system, which connected her pacemaker to a phone application, suddenly went offline. 41 minutes. That number quickly became one of the most discussed details in the investigation, because investigators now had a digital window of time where something clearly changed inside that house. Detectives began mapping activity from surrounding cameras, phone towers, and smart home systems in the area. Every digital trace that might reveal movement during that period was examined. Then investigators returned to Annie Guthrie's property for a second search. This time it wasn't a simple walkthrough. Deputies documented every visible surface: floors, storage areas, the garage, even ceiling beams where trace evidence could theoretically settle. Evidence bags were carried out to waiting vehicles while investigators continued photographing the scene. Neighbors watching from nearby homes described it as methodical, almost like detectives were reconstructing a moment they believed had already happened. And while all of that was taking place, another detail began circulating online. According to a family representative, Annie Guthrie wasn't even staying at the house during that second search. She had relocated somewhere else temporarily. That detail only fueled more questions, because in the middle of an active investigation involving her own mother's disappearance, people were asking why she would leave at all. Investigators, however, weren't focused on speculation. They were focused on the timeline, and that timeline was becoming harder to explain.
Something happened here just a few minutes ago. We received an email at TMZ from somebody.
As investigators continued piecing together Nancy Guthrie's final known hours, the case slowly began shifting away from the original theory of a random abduction. Early speculation had focused on the possibility that someone unfamiliar with the family had targeted the home under cover of darkness. But detectives were now examining something far more complicated: the people closest to Nancy, and that shift began with data. Investigators compared Tommaso Caone's account of the evening with traffic cameras positioned along nearby streets. The timestamps didn't directly contradict his explanation of dropping Nancy off at her house, but they didn't perfectly match either. The difference was small, not dramatic, but enough to raise questions. When detectives encounter small discrepancies like that, they rarely ignore them. Instead, they start expanding the investigation outward. Forensic technicians examined the vehicle used that night, collecting fibers and dust samples from floor mats, seats, and storage compartments. They also pulled digital information stored within the car's onboard system. Modern vehicles record an incredible amount of information. GPS movement, ignition cycles, door activity, and even driving patterns can sometimes be recovered. Those digital traces can become extremely important when investigators are trying to confirm where someone was at a specific moment. At the same time, detectives were analyzing phone records linked to people who had been in contact with Nancy that evening. Calls, messages, and location signals were mapped across the same timeline investigators had already built using smart home devices. Because in today's world, almost every movement leaves behind some kind of electronic footprint. Phones connect to towers, cars communicate with navigation systems, security cameras quietly record passing headlights. Individually, those details might seem insignificant. Together, they can create a map of events investigators can follow minute by minute. And that map eventually led detectives back to the same question: what happened during those 41 minutes? Around the same time, another development began circulating through online forums and news outlets. Anonymous sources claimed investigators had discovered something during the second search of Annie's property. Officials never confirmed exactly what that discovery was, but the description shared by those sources was simple. It changed the direction of the investigation. Those words spread across the internet almost instantly, and they triggered an entirely new wave of speculation. Some commentators believed investigators had uncovered physical evidence connecting the house to Nancy's disappearance. Others suspected financial records or digital information might be involved, because financial motives are often examined in cases involving family members. Nancy Guthrie reportedly controlled significant assets, including property holdings and investment accounts that had been organized through a family trust. Online analysts quickly began asking the obvious question: who benefits? Unconfirmed reports suggested changes may have been made to the structure of that trust not long before Nancy disappeared. No official documentation confirming those claims has been released, but the timing alone fueled debate across social media platforms. Some people argued the financial angle was exaggerated speculation. Others believed detectives were quietly examining it behind the scenes. Either way, the story was changing. This was no longer just a mystery about a missing woman. Now investigators were also exploring the possibility of motive. And once motive becomes part of the conversation, every detail surrounding the case begins to look different. Every conversation, every financial movement, every unexplained moment, especially 41 minutes. Because if that narrow window of time contains evidence of planning or coordination, it could completely reshape how the entire investigation unfolds. For now, investigators remain careful about what information they release publicly. But behind the scenes, the timeline continues to grow more complicated. And the deeper detectives dig, the more questions appear.
There, everybody. I wanted to come on and just share a few thoughts as we enter into another week of this nightmare.
Then came the consequences that follow almost every high-profile investigation: public reaction. Within hours of Annie Guthrie being taken into custody for questioning, legal analysts began appearing on television networks discussing what charges investigators might eventually pursue if prosecutors believe a crime occurred: kidnapping, conspiracy, obstruction of an investigation. None of those charges had been officially announced, but legal experts explained that cases involving missing family members often evolve slowly as investigators continue reviewing evidence. Sources close to the investigation suggested a grand jury could eventually review sealed information collected by detectives. That possibility alone intensified national attention surrounding the case. Sheriff Chris Nanos addressed reporters during a short press conference the following morning. He confirmed that investigators were acting on cumulative findings gathered during weeks of evidence analysis. Cumulative findings means the decision wasn't based on one dramatic discovery. Instead, it suggests detectives identified multiple details that together formed a pattern investigators felt required further action. Meanwhile, Tommaso Keone had not been charged with any crime, but photographers captured him leaving a law office late that evening, walking quickly past reporters who shouted questions about the investigation. His attorney released a short statement saying they were confident the truth would eventually become clear. Statements like that are common during ongoing investigations, but they often signal that legal teams expect a long and complicated process ahead. Behind the scenes, another ripple began spreading through the financial world. Banks connected to accounts held by members of the Guthrie family reportedly began conducting routine compliance reviews. These reviews don't necessarily indicate wrongdoing, but they are standard practice when financial institutions detect unusual activity during high-profile investigations. Large transfers, property changes, or account restructuring can trigger automated reviews designed to prevent fraud or financial misconduct. At the same time, federal analysts were reportedly assisting investigators with digital forensics, phone location data, encrypted messaging platforms, vehicle telemetry records. In modern investigations, digital evidence often plays a crucial role. Even when people believe they have erased communication or location information, fragments of data can still remain stored across networks and backup systems. Those fragments sometimes reveal patterns investigators can follow, and if those patterns suggest planning or coordination, prosecutors may not need direct eyewitness testimony. The data itself can become the witness. Outside the Guthrie residence, crowds began gathering as the story spread across national news broadcasts. Some people held signs demanding justice for Nancy Guthrie. Others insisted the investigation was unfairly targeting a grieving daughter before all the facts were known. The division in public opinion was immediate and intense, because cases involving families tend to affect people differently. Some see betrayal, others see tragedy, and sometimes the truth ends up being far more complicated than either side expects. For investigators, however, the central mystery remains unchanged at 41 minutes. 41 minutes inside a quiet home where something interrupted an ordinary night at 41 minutes that may determine whether Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was the result of misunderstanding, manipulation, or something far more deliberate. Right now, detectives continue examining every piece of information they can gather. every device, every record, every statement. Because somewhere inside that growing mountain of evidence is the answer to a single question. What really happened that night? So here we are. An arrest, a fractured timeline, quiet financial rumors, digital breadcrumbs, and 41 minutes that still refuse to explain themselves. Was this the result of panic hidden behind a carefully polished family image? Or are we witnessing a story spinning faster than the evidence can keep up? Because the reality is simple. In today's world, information travels faster than confirmation. One headline can reshape how millions of people see a family overnight. One anonymous source can ignite a storm of speculation. And one arrest can divide the public into two completely different camps. So what do you think? Do you believe Annie Guthrie is connected to something deliberate and calculated? Or do you believe investigators may be focusing on the closest person simply because the case still lacks clear answers? Let me know in the comments. And don't just write guilty or innocent. Tell me what detail makes you lean one way or the other. Was it the timeline, the digital evidence, the financial angle, or those unexplained 41 minutes inside Nancy's home? Because cases like this rarely stay quiet for long. New documents surface, new testimony appears, and sometimes the smallest overlooked detail can flip the entire narrative overnight. If you made it this far, leave a like so more people can see the breakdown and join the conversation. Subscribe if you want updates as this investigation develops. And turn on notifications because the next development in this case could change everything. Stay curious, stay critical, and remember, the truth has a way of surfacing eventually.